Hey folks, David Stewart here. It's time for my promised review of Netflix's Bright, starring Will Smith. Bright is actually an urban fantasy film, which is pretty cool. We don't get too many urban fantasy films, even though it's a pretty hot literary genre. And they also spent a lot of money on it. So there's a high budget, high production value for this movie, which is Netflix's attempt to make a sort of straight to streaming blockbuster experience. Don't go to the movies, stay in and stream a blockbuster, and fulfills a lot of the expectations of a blockbuster. And so for that reason, I think it's a success for Netflix. And from that perspective, I think we can judge it as a success. And I hope that they'll take that and maybe make some more straight to streaming blockbusters to compete with Hollywood. That would please me. Now, what's interesting about it is it takes a niche audience in urban fantasy. Even though it's hot in literature, that's not everybody, right? So you can have a hot genre in literature that's only like 2% of people. And then kind of popularizes it, brings it into the blockbuster category by combining it with a buddy cop movie. So you have an urban fantasy buddy cop movie. And if I, in fact, were to pick one word to describe this movie, it would be eclectic. Because not only do they use two sort of diverse things, fantasy elements and buddy cop movie, but they also use diverse, different sets of cinematography techniques, different pieces of sound design, different approaches to the soundtrack. The soundtrack is very eclectic. And so you get a movie that is a big combination of lots of different diverse elements. But overall, I think the movie ends up coming out as more than the sum of its very different parts and ends up being a pretty enjoyable experience. And it is one that I will recommend, and I'll get to the scores in just a little bit. Now, what you need to know about this movie, whether you're going to like it or not, if you're a fan of urban fantasy, I think this is a movie that you ought to see. If you're a fan of buddy cop movies, you may not like this because of the fantasy elements, but I still think it's worth giving it a shot. If you have a Netflix account, the worst thing that can happen is you don't like it after a while and turn it off, and you've lost a little bit of time to know that this is something that you aren't going to like. The setting is basically modern America. In fact, the main characters are in the LAPD, but we have added to it some very specific fantasy elements. So we have different fantasy races that are part of society. So at the bottom of society, we have these orcs, and people don't really like orcs and are kind of racist towards them because they sided with the Dark One, this Dark Lord 2,000 years before. So basically, they sided with evil, and people kind of viewed them negatively, like they view them as guilty of the crimes of their fathers. And then at the top of society, you have elves, kind of like the aristocratic, top of society. And then in the middle, you have the humans. Now, racial allegories are going to be unavoidable in this movie. However, I don't see this as like some kind of SJW, beat you over the head with racial guilt kind of approach to race. It's a more generalized approach to race. And the main message that you get from this sort of stratification in the movie is that you shouldn't prejudge people based on their racial group. You shouldn't prejudge people based on what group membership they have, and that's a flaw that the main character Will Smith kind of has to overcome in the movie. So I don't see that as I see that as like an egalitarian message, and indeed the way that I hope most people will approach race, rather than something that's more from the modern SJW, modern intersectional feminist movement, which tends to focus a lot on people's group memberships and kind of holding them as guilty for being a member of a group or needing to sort of upend some sort of privilege strata based on group membership. So that's really what it's about. It's about not prejudging people with their groups, and I think that's a good message. Another thing that's really important about the setting that we'll get to when we get to the story is that this movie doesn't approach magic in what's called magical realist way. If you're not super familiar with magical realism, it's one idea that you see a lot in fantasy where you are going to approach magic and make it mundane. The parts that are mundane in this film are the fantasy races, the orcs, the elves. There's even a centaur in one scene, but he doesn't have any speaking lines. And there's like some fairies, which are nasty little pests like owls in Futurama or whatever. That part's mundane, but magic is not. We don't have magic as like an accepted part of reality. It's something rare. It's something sought after. There's a group of like federal agents that are tasked with containing magic and seeking it out and containing the threat of magic. So magic is a fantastical thing, and that's necessary for the plot to sort of be driven. You have a relationship with magic that's kind of similar to like maybe the One Ring in Lord of the Rings, that it's dangerous and rare. That's important. So if you're worried about, I don't want to see a bunch of wizards, there's not a bunch of wizards. The magic doesn't really take effect until you're sort of well into the movie and have kind of accepted the reality that you're being presented with. With that in mind, let me get through my numerical breakdown. Everyone likes numbers. I'm going to be trying to develop and refine this numbering, this quantitative system as I go throughout the year and review movies and review books. Because when you have that number attached to all the qualitative things, you're able to get an idea of like, this is an approval or disapproval. This movie will be an approval. This will be a, I think it's a movie that people ought to watch. So I'm going to start with production. My overall production score is 7.8, and that's composed of a couple of different subcategories. I thought the production values, like the story itself, they're really eclectic. They mix a lot of production values as well as story elements, and that's a little bit uneven in outcome, but overall the production value is pretty high. And I enjoyed the production for what it was. I think it'll satisfy most people who are coming at a movie with an expectation of high production value with a blockbuster. I don't think you're going to come into it and feel like it was a cheap movie or anything like that. So the aesthetics is the first category. Aesthetics is going to be the visuals, the sound, everything that goes into the design of the movie from that perspective, the visual design in particular. I thought the aesthetics, I'm going to give them an 8 out of 10. I think they hit the fantasy like really right. The orc makeup looked really good, and it was very convincing for me. There was even parts where like the nose twitched and stuff. The look of the orcs was varied enough and interesting enough that I believed that those people were orcs, which is not true of a lot of makeup that's sort of put on to make people look like some other fantasy race. So I thought the makeup worked really well. And they also added to this aesthetic like graffiti that has to do with these races, graffiti about the return of the Dark Lord, that's just sort of in the background and on the walls, but really adds to the whole atmosphere of the piece, and is pretty functional. The only thing that sort of brings this down is that there's some use of martial arts by like the elves that's really awkward and weird and doesn't really like jive with me. I'm like, I don't know why they would do that. This is some kind of an objection I have to a lot of movies where it's like somebody counters guns with flipping through the air. And so I'm putting that in the aesthetic category because it kind of breaks that immersion that I talk about so often. You get kind of broken out of the immersion of what is otherwise a pretty like believable world. And the thing about it is like the elements are so disparate, they're so eclectic. You have an urban LA, like South Central LA, with graffiti everywhere, but graffiti that has orcs in it, and orcs as gangsters dressed up like gangsters, but then there's also black and Mexican gangsters. Everything's kind of so hodgepodge that you almost don't accept it, but about the time the first big plot point happens, by that time you've had enough exposition of it, you just kind of go with it, and it becomes a believable experience. So 8 out of 10 for the aesthetics. Cinematography, I'm also giving an 8 out of 10. It was good cinematography for the most part, with a couple of exceptions. There was a lot of creative types of cinematography. And the cinematography styles, it's like they were pulled out of these different genres of movies to give you the feeling of that genre of movie. So there's a kind of documentary style where they're driving in the cop car talking to each other and the camera's mounted and shakes a little bit, and it's like you're just observing two people having a casual conversation. The dialogue's awkward, the pauses are somewhat awkward, and it feels pretty real, and that sort of neutral camera as a third person kind of helps that. There's also some shots where like the camera pulls back at the back of a hall and you hear the reverb of the dialogue, like you're a distant observer to something that's like very emotional that's happening between Will Smith and his daughter when she's like, I don't want you to die. So that some of those little production values like have a big impact and kind of click when you see them. However, that doesn't stick. You have traditional action kind of stuff. There's even shaky cam stuff throughout a lot of the action, which I don't really like shaky cam. It's kind of a modern thing that turns me off. So that's a little bit of a downgrade. And then in some cases, there's so many different cinematography techniques used there's such a wide variety of it. It's so eclectic that it might be a little bit off-putting to people. It'll feel uneven rather than merely just a combination of different elements. So that's sort of my thought on cinematography. Overall, I like the creativity of the cinematography for sure. Sound design, I'm giving it a 7 out of 10. I could give it a lower score, but to me, I think they did what they wanted to do with the sound design. It's clearly a home theater mix. It's clearly a home mix, a TV mix, meaning the sort of variation between louds and soft in the movie are not really extreme. And the louds that we have are like a real saturation of the sound rather than a big peak. And maybe I can do a video sometime on like different kinds of sound design. Ideal sound design to me is like, Star Wars pre-Disney. That's like, George Lucas's sound design that he oversaw was some of the best that you see in movies where things really have an impact. But that doesn't translate well to home video because TVs have to be cranked up really loud to where the speakers distort with the louds, and then you can barely hear the dialogue. So in this case, it's much more compressed and evened out, but that's necessary for a home theater mix. Still, though, when things explode, it feels like an explosion through the saturation that's there. They're kind of fill up the frequencies rather than having like a big peak in like one concentrated high frequency, like what you get with like a lightsaber, for example. So overall, the sound design, pretty good. It's a home mix, which means it's not going to sound as good if you have a great system. You're going to definitely hear the limitations of what they did, and you might rate it lower than a 7 if you heard it on a great system. But if you heard it on a normal system, it's going to be probably 7 out of 10. I listened to it on studio monitors right here in front of me. They're great. It's what I mixed my album on, so it sounded really good to me. Special effects, I also listened to them, with a good pair of headphones, and it does sound good with the headphones. Special effects, I give them an 8 out of 10. They really emphasized practical effects for most of the action, which I think makes it feel really realistic and more sort of like a classic action film and a buddy cop film. So if you're into like actual cars exploding and all that kind of stuff, they got it, and it works really, really well. When they do bring the magic elements in, they do some interesting combinations with the cinematography where they have the camera kind of shake a little bit as they like pull the magic wand out. The plot kind of centers around this glowing magic wand, and then the light of the magic wand kind of changes the way everything looks. And it's a really kind of simple set of computer effects, but ones that are pretty effective. And I didn't mention the set designs. This goes into aesthetics. The set designs start off as pretty standard and like how you might expect in an urban movie, but as you get further into it, it's like you're leaving reality further and further behind. It's like Heart of Darkness or something, and you get to these really fantastic sets where they have like glowing fountains and weird trees and all kinds of odd things that end up working, particularly the like layer of the orcs, which has these really bizarre decorations in them, very Baroque and like kind of hard to focus on. So those can be kind of put in parts of the special effects as well, because there's special effects used with those, and those work pretty well. So overall, special effects are 8 out of 10. The limitations of the effects are mostly like the limitations of how they chose to do the movie. Rather than show me bad effects, they chose to limit what they were doing, and I appreciate that for sure. Soundtrack, I'm going to give an 8 out of 10. The soundtrack will not be everyone's cup of tea because it's highly eclectic. There's a mix of sort of urban music, like rap music or hip hop influenced beats, ambient music, and ambient rock that's kind of mixed in. There's even metal. All the orcs like listen to metal. They're super into death metal, which is kind of funny to me and kind of like a cool little touch. And then there's orchestra tracks as well. These standard classical themed orchestra tracks that kind of go along with the elves. And the use of the soundtrack, because it's so eclectic, it's used with all these other eclectic devices. So when they're doing like the training day style drive around in the cop car, you have this like urban soundtrack. When they're just kind of like going through different eerie places, you have kind of an ambient soundtrack. When the elves are doing stuff, you hear sort of classical music. It's an interesting approach to the soundtrack, and I did appreciate it. It will not be for everyone, but if you're not super conscious of the soundtrack, you're going to feel like it just kind of goes with whatever eclectic element they're bringing in for a particular scene. So that means overall production value 7.8, which is pretty good. I think that they could do a little bit better in the future. Certainly, by evening things out when they do the next installment of it. But overall, that's good. 7.8 to me is good production value. For me, anything above 6 is like recommended, and like 8, 9 are really good, and 10 would be like best I've seen. Just to give you an idea of what 10 means to me. So let's talk about the story. The story, I think, is good and effective. I talked about the setting a little bit. I give the setting a 7 out of 10, not because the setting is bad. I have a couple things with the setting that, like, why, if we had these fantasy races, would LA look so familiar? So that's a little bit of a disbelief or kind of a restriction on my immersion there. And it's a kind of a hard mix. It's not an easy, soft mix. We have a really familiar America, and then we have these races on top of it, and those kind of don't work together. However, by the time the big conflict arrives with this magic wand, kind of filling in, I don't know, by that time you sort of just buy the setting and you kind of are into it, and the magic wand kind of starts to sell you, and the action starts to sell you, because rather than kind of displaying things as an exposition, you're rolling through the fantasy elements they've established in the first 30 or 40 minutes and kind of seeing them at work, and then you buy into the setting a little bit more. So it ends up becoming kind of a 7 out of 10. And I think the setting contributes to a great deal to that racial message I talked about, which I do not consider like an SJWE kind of message. So if you're really worried about the message upsetting you or being like, it's a liberal message, but not, in my opinion, at all a negative liberal message. It's more a message about judging individuals, not judging them on their group. Next category, characters and acting. I actually am going to give this a 9 out of 10. Other people are going to disagree with me. I think Will Smith really nails his character. That's why he was chosen. He sold his character in Bad Boys. This is not the character from Bad Boys, and Will Smith actually has a bigger range of acting than some people give him credit. But it's that streetwise cop, and he really sells it at the beginning, but he also shows his character develop throughout the movie, and there's some great scenes where he has to make a really tough moral choice about what he has to do, and Will Smith owns it on the acting level. I found him very convincing when he had to make those decisions. Essentially, this movie is focused on the two main characters, which is Will Smith as one cop, and then as Joel Edgerton as the orc cop. So there's the first orc cop in the LAPD. His name is Jacoby, and he's teamed up with Will Smith's character, and Will Smith doesn't want to be teamed up with him. Will Smith has gotten shot at the beginning of the plot, and this isn't a big spoiler, you're going to get it right at the beginning. Of course he was wearing body armor, but that's a terrifying experience, and he kind of blames his partner, and he has to kind of learn to overcome that and kind of accept and figure out who Jacoby is as a person rather than as like an orc. And the entire story with these two characters, it's two characters that are trying really hard to do the right thing in a nihilistic world, a world that doesn't have any clearly set morals, including the police officers that are on the beat, that are working around these two characters. They are not like morally centered people either, and so there's constantly a demand upon Will Smith's character, and to a lesser extent upon Jacoby's character, but that takes place later in the plot. There's constantly a demand that they do something that they don't agree with morally, that they think is wrong, and they have to make a really tough choice for them whether they're going to do it and how they're going to do it. And Will Smith initially is sort of getting bullied by the other police officers and is going to end up trying to like sell out his partner, this orc, and comes to a point around the first plot point, kind of a point of no return. He has to make a choice whether he's going to act morally or whether he's going to do what this sort of evil world, kind of nihilist, not just evil, but the people around them don't have morals. They're a little bit like nihilistic in that sense. What they really want him to do. There's a world that's not so concerned with right and wrong, but he as a character has to be. And he has to make those tough choices. And so that really like amps up to me the quality of the characters. And I ended up really liking the two main characters by the end. The supporting characters help with that role, including Lucy Fry as Tika, like this elf who doesn't even have any English speaking lines until the very end of the movie. She works as works well as a supporting character. She kind of is there driving the plot forward, but isn't there contributing to the dialogue or upsetting this tension between Will Smith's character and Joel Edgerton's character. So overall, I thought the characters and the acting were 9 out of 10. There was no bad acting. I think the actors are all really good in this movie. However, the dialogue, I give a 6 out of 10. So most of the dialogue's fine, and a lot of it's pretty natural, and in some cases it's intentionally awkward as you are sort of witnessing these two characters kind of butt up against each other and not get along, and Jacoby doesn't know how to do like human mannerisms and is having trouble getting people to like him. But at the same time, you have a bunch of one-liners that don't really work. They kind of fall flat. They're not that funny. And then you have in a lot of places you actually have some stilted dialogue that brings down the quality of the scene. There's one scene in particular I'm thinking of where Will Smith's character is being sort of confronted by internal affairs. Will Smith's character's name is Daryl Ward, by the way. So Daryl's kind of being confronted by internal affairs, and they're telling him facts about his life that he already knows. They're like, yeah, you got a kid and, you're trying to sell your house. It's like, we knew that from the exposition part. They didn't have to repeat that. And you kind of get the feeling when you hear dialogue like that they felt like the audience would have forgotten these elements or wouldn't believe that this character was motivated to do what these people are telling him unless they kind of spelled it out. It's what I call stilted dialogue. You are essentially telling the audience what they should have already known. Kind of like if you see it in movies where it's like you have Iron Man rushing at the monster and he's like, I'm going to attack the monster. Like he tells you what he's doing as he does it. It's not necessary, right? It's better to just not have that dialogue or to have them say something natural. We really like to watch dialogue that's natural, and so a lot of the dialogue just wasn't that natural, including some of the one-liners like "Fairy lives matter" or "Fairy lives don't matter today," when Will Smith kills a little pestilent fairy. Now, the last part, plot. I give the plot an 8 out of 10. Plot worked for me. So there's a hero's journey arc in Will Smith, including, I mentioned, that point of no return, and they did something really interesting with the plot in a couple of points that I think is worth talking about. It's really hard to talk about without giving significant spoilers. But whenever you have a plot goal, you have a goal for a story, like this thing is happening to resolve the story. That's what we want to happen. You are going to create tension in the audience by changing the certainty of that happening. And so in some cases, you're uncertain of the outcome of a particular event, then they do something that you actually don't want them. They give you the failure outcome of a tense moment where it's like, are they going to kill this guy? Or are they not going to kill this guy? Is this person going to get shot? Is he not going to get shot? And they do what you don't want them to do, and then they find a way out of it, which is very, very interesting, because if you're able to give the audience a lot of what they don't want to see, it's kind of like a monster movie. If you give them some stuff they don't want to see, they become more and more uncertain about what you do later in the plot, which makes the plot more tense and effective. There was a lot more tension in this movie, and this also cues into cinematography. A lot more tension in this movie than what you get in a regular blockbuster movie. There's a lot more moments of waiting for something to happen, waiting for the gun to be fired, waiting to figure out what's going to happen, rather than like fighting robots stimulation. So there's a difference between stimulation and tension. This movie has tension. They let you wait during the moments that matter so that you can sit there and ponder and really want something to happen before they give it to you or don't give it to you. And so for that reason, I think the execution of the plot is really, really well done. Now, there are a couple of little issues with the plot. There's some times where you are like, I'm not quite certain how they did that. I'm not quite certain that they would be able to do that. I don't know how they figured out where to go and show up there. And so those sound kind of big, but in most cases they're like really minor things. And I don't want to do it with spoilers, but it's kind of like there's a point where it's like, I wonder how they knew that they were there, but they're not affecting the plot in any way, so you don't. It doesn't matter quite as much. So there's a couple little things like that. Those little points probably could have been improved just by lengthening the movie by a couple of minutes. And with a straight to streaming service, I think you have the option to do that. I don't think you have to cut things so tight as they do for the theaters to get that 90-minute movie in. And I think that's actually the strength of the movie, is that we have not such a tight editing that we can't see what's happening. A couple places it's still pretty tight, but overall, the cinematography and editing, which, to return to that topic once again, is good enough that it's more like a classic movie and not so modern. And that to me means you can get tension and understand what's happening a lot better. So overall, plot 8 out of 10. That brings my story rating to a 7.5 out of 10. So that's an approval. And lastly, general effect. I'm giving the general effect 8 out of 10. This is a broad category. This is basically my opinion of how much I liked it. I liked it enough to give it an 8 out of 10. That's a pretty good recommendation for me. Although it's really eclectic, I don't mind eclectic so much. And although I was a little bit resistant to it in the first 30 or 40 minutes of the movie, by the time the first big conflict happens with Will Smith's character, it all just starts banging on all cylinders to the end. Things just explode, and there's a ton of action going forward, and you just end up buying into what's happening, and you just end up enjoying it. There's, the plot and the action. The action's a little bit unbelievable at times, so that kind of brought it down. Anything that brings me out of the immersion, so like elves doing martial arts, I didn't really care for that, but it wasn't enough to make me say that the movie, that I didn't like the movie. I'm not one of those people that's like, I didn't like this one thing, therefore the movie's bad. So this is one thing I didn't like, but I still like the movie overall. Most of the action's really visceral, very gory, and very tense, and very exciting, and really well done. Lots of practical effects, and I enjoyed that as well. And all of those moments of pause and indecision, and times for the characters to sit and talk about their intentions and to figure out what they're going to do next, and lots of moments where you are uncertain of the outcome, that and where you really want certain outcomes to happen, and then something different happens. So overall, that was really, really effective to me. And I do like fantasy, and I like urban fantasy, and I like buddy cop movies, so it had a bunch of elements that I happen to enjoy, and I think they, although they're pretty disparate, they worked well enough together, especially by the middle of the movie, that I ended up liking the movie and enjoying watching it. So it's a niche genre film kind of made into a buddy cop movie, and I think that'll appeal to a lot of people. Maybe it'll appeal to you, but if there's, if you listen to this review and it's clear to you that, oh, that's something I really can't stand in movies, I hate seeing like little fantasy races with modern buildings, then yeah, it's not going to be a movie that you're going to like, but that you don't have to watch it. And if you have Netflix and you're somebody that's kind of interested in fantasy or just wants to see something different, it takes these familiar elements but combines them in a way that it really becomes more than the sum of its parts. If that appeals to you, then I think you'll like this movie. So thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Needle Ash is actually alive, my next short little book series. It's 3 short books this time around. You can get all 3 of them for free for the next little while if you're on my mailing list. Go to dvspress.com/list and get on either one of those main lists, and you'll get access to all of them. 1 and 2 are out on Amazon and any other digital provider of your choice. The first one is free on most platforms, but not on Amazon yet. And otherwise, they're 99 cents if you want to buy them. You can do that and support me, and I'm super appreciative. Otherwise, get on the mailing list and you get them early, get them for free. I really want to have people on that mailing list so that I can give you stuff early because I want to release a lot of books in 2018. I have a lot of stuff to look forward to this year, and I'd like you to be on that journey with me. But if you don't want to, that's okay too. I still appreciate you watching and giving me your opinion of the movie down below, and what sort of things you might disagree with me on, or what things you thought were better or worse, and give me your sort of final score with all those crazy categories that I talked about, which I'm going to be working on refining this year in 2018. Thank you, and I will see you next time.